Happy New Year, everyone. We are back in 2023 on the ownership economy with a packed schedule of entrepreneurs, venture investors, policymakers, and other thought leaders working to build inclusive economies around the world. In this episode of the ownership economy, we speak with Stephen Martin from TripsTrade. Steve comes from a background in the property rental market, a $2.3 trillion industry. Along with his co-founder, Petro Sideris, Steve is working to build a new model for short-term property rentals, like vacations and hotel bookings. We all have at one point or another had to cancel a booking without a refund. TripsTrade aims to fix that entire market, and in the meantime is building some interesting Web 2 to Web 3 tools that will help everyone more easily adopt blockchain technologies. We hope you enjoy the episode. Hey, Steve, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
So we like to start these out by hearing a little bit of your background. Could you tell us in a few minutes about how you got to TripsTrade, your background, your career? Give us a little bit of who you are.
Yeah, sure. So my relevant background for TripsTrade, I've been in crypto for a while, but my family runs a property rental business on the short-term side in Bermuda. And we've been running the same properties for a little bit over 50 years now. So it's a multi-generational business. So we know the rental game pretty well, specifically the short-term rental game. It's literally in my blood. But in that business, we've seen a lot of insights into the technological states of the business we were running, and we were one of the first Airbnb adopters in Bermuda, actually, one of the first 5 properties on there. But as somebody who's helping to run the business, when COVID came down, we had an experience in particular that I noticed left a pretty obvious technological gap in the space. And that was on these short-term rental systems that you use online, whether it's VRBO, Airbnb, or even some direct booking systems, you have typically cancellation policies that are hard-coded into the system. And so what this means is, in our case, if you cancel with, depending on your rental, less than 60 or 30 days before your rental, you will not get all or some of your money back, right? During COVID time, we had a lot of repeat customers who we didn't want to offend and we didn't want to just kind of screw over, who, due to reasons they couldn't control, had to cancel last minute. And at the same time, we had this weird situation where we had a ton of people who were beating down our doors trying to rent, willing to pay double or more because they knew they were going to get quarantined and they would rather get quarantined on a beach in Bermuda than wherever they were living. And what we discovered was the existing technological and booking systems literally did not allow, in some cases, for us to refund people after that cancellation date was passed. So we were manually middlemaning a lot of these rebookings, sending the first party who owned the rental like a contract to allow them to opt out, and then going to the second rental, taking their money OTC, sending them a new contract, and then going to the first party and sending them back some of their money. We did that like 50 or 60 times, and I was just thinking to myself the whole time, this is so dumb. Why can't the people who have paid to stay here, who own the rental, own the booking, why can't they just sell to the person who wants to book? Right? Why do I need to sit here and middleman this? And in looking into it, I realized that no one had built any systems for that, and that the best system to actually represent that booking as a digital tradable asset was NFTs. And that we could build a system where every rental or lease or booking that someone paid for was like an actual asset that they held and that they could trade. And then I would never have to deal with this bullshit again. So that was ultimately led to us deciding to build TripsTrade.
Awesome. And so you talk a little bit about the opaqueness in kind of the OTC market. How big is the global real estate rental market?
Well, if you count long-term and short-term, every rental on Earth, if you exclude commercial rentals, about $2 trillion. The short-term side of that is about $75 billion a year as of 2021. Those numbers are a little bit off because of COVID, but what you get from that is that the short-term side of things is a very, very small portion of overall real estate rentals.
And even large property managers have no way of dealing with this in a liquid system. It's all OTC.
On the long-term side, yeah. And, the closest thing that exists to kind of what we're talking about, these merchants, and a merchant for reference is somebody like an Expedia or a Travelocity. What they will do is they will go purchase rooms from hotels at rack rates, which is just the discount rate you get when you're willing to spend enough money at once buying a bunch of rooms at a hotel. And they, like you said, there is no actual asset for them to transfer those assets to another person. They just have all of this recorded on independent databases. And that's what has led to the kind of system that we have, where this is an enormous, literally multi-trillion-dollar market with no representation for any of the assets. But it is a completely solvable problem, and I do think we've solved that.
And so you've got 10 years of kind of industry experience, right? I mean, you've worked in this market before TripsTrade for 10 years beyond your own family experience, and all of this is done OTC.
Yeah, the entire rental market around the world is done OTC. Whether you're talking long-term or short-term, there is no actual digital representation of rental contracts that can be sent from one, siloed customer base to another, from one database to another, or anything like that. The closest thing to this that exists is merchants, which are parties like Expedia or Travelocity, who they will go buy rooms from hotels and things like that at rack rates, which is just the rate you get when you spend a lot of money buying a lot of hotel rooms at once. And then they will resell it through their own website or websites, right? So they do have multiple websites tapping into the same database, but ultimately there still is no actual digital representation of the asset that is a lease. If someone at Expedia wanted to transfer a booking from any part of the Expedia like conglomerate, right? Expedia or any of its subsidiaries to any part of the Booking.com conglomerate, which is Booking.com and any of its subsidiaries. The only way for them to actually do that is to pick up the phone or email someone at the other side, confirm it, get a contract in place, sign the contract, and then transfer it, right? And this is just part of why you don't see a lot of cooperation between these guys. That obviously doesn't make sense when they're competitors, and it certainly doesn't make sense when the average ticket price for these things is like $80 or $90. But this is a multi-trillion-dollar market if you include both the short and long-term rental side of things, by providing tradable assets and allowing them to be built on interoperable standards where any two parties can, with open source technology, transfer them between each other. We're opening up the potential for a very large market to go from being entirely OTC to digitized and liquid.
Cool. And you mentioned a couple other kind of reasons why the market has remained opaque to date in the white paper, specific fungibility and kind of failure to deliver on escrow payments. So can you just kind of break those two challenges down for us so that we can really understand what TripsTrade solves?
Yeah, sure. On the fungibility side, I mean, this is pretty straightforward. If you actually think of rental contracts, they're kind of like snowflakes. No two rental contracts are exactly the same, right? Because by default, they are designated from each other by geospatial or like time and location, right? Even if you have two rooms right next to each other in a hotel, they're not always going to get rented out for the exact same amount, and they're not technically in the exact same location. So no exact lease is the same as any other lease, even if they might be very similar. So it is a multi-trillion-dollar asset class where each asset is meaningfully different from each other asset, because some areas might have significantly different demand for one block down the way or one block in the other direction. And some areas might have significantly different demand for a different time of the year, right? You have certain areas like Bermuda, for example, has a peak season where rentals will be 2-3 times as much as they are during the off season. So it's a very large asset class, but in order to have it be digitally represented and tradable, you have to find an interoperable standard that you can build on that actually does a good job of tokenizing non-fungible assets. And so obviously NFTs, which are non-fungible tokens built on a completely permissionless and interoperable standard, are a pretty good tech solution for that. On the escrow side, this is kind of going into the weeds a little bit, but if you actually think about the process of making one of these leases resellable, right? You have this kind of incentive issue. If you have the money clear to the property owner straight away, right? For certain property owners, that might not be something that you're particularly worried about. Like a Hilton or a Hyatt, I don't really mind if I pay them right away and they get all their money right away. But if it's some guy who's just renting out a room in his home, I would be worried that if I paid this guy right away and he got all the money before I stayed there, I might show up and he might just tell me to screw off, and I would have to take him to court or something to get my money back. So you need this system where the money stays in escrow up until a certain period of time after check-in, right? And then you need a dispute capability for the customer who has checked in to this property and now has some sort of issue where they go there and it wasn't as advertised, or it's not clean or something like that, and they want to get their money back. But that means that you have to actually bundle the claim to the money that was paid for the rental with the party that currently owns it as the potential receiver instead of just the initial renter. So it's a little bit complicated, but it effectively means that you have to have this NFT as a trading instrument, not merely include the right to actually stay at the property and the interaction with the UI and the UX that lets somebody, check into the property using their confirmation code, but you have to also have it act as kind of a key that enables that party to, in the event that they're not liking what they see and they want to dispute, claim a refund if the property isn't as advertised. These are all pretty difficult technical challenges. We've built systems around fixing all of them, and I certainly hope we can get into the escrow in a little bit because I think it's pretty revolutionary. But up until, kind of NFTs and blockchain systems, there were no real easy ways to do this because you have this problem of, okay, Expedia wants to transfer a rental from Expedia to Booking.com. Where does the responsibility to see that dispute and clear that payment to the customer now lie? Where does that money actually stay? Who has the custodian risk of that money? Building a custodian-free smart contract to handle the whole escrow process is a big part of what makes this all possible as an interoperable system. And there's one more thing that you didn't kind of mention in terms of the difficulty of doing this in the past that we've managed to work our way around. When you're talking about the short-term rental side of this equation, there really was a problem with timing on making this like a possible thing. For something like TripsTrade to happen where homeowners or hotel owners are selling rooms to any random person online so that they can further resell them to another random person online, we first had to get to the point where homeowners and hotel owners were comfortable with the idea of renting out to random people on the internet, right? This was the hump that Airbnb cleared successfully by pioneering the home share model. Most people don't know this, but if you kind of read interviews with Brian Chesky or things like that, in the early days, it was actually quite a stumbling block for them to convince homeowners that it was safe to just rent to a random person that they never met or who hadn't been vetted by a real estate agent, which is how you used to do things, right? But so you had that system where renter or homeowners are now comfortable interacting with effectively just totally random renters. Now what we need to do what we do and enable anyone to act as a merchant and then resell those rentals, you had to have a system that would actually create a digitized representation of the rental or the lease and do so with an interoperable standard so that the digitized representation of the lease wasn't just artificially siloed to your platform. Because under the merchant model that Expedia, Travelocity, those guys have, you have this kind of issue where if you don't aggregate enough demand into a given merchant, there's an inherent demand, there's an inherent disadvantage for the secondary reseller compared to the initial primary seller, right? If a hotel owner is advertising their properties, they're listing on every single platform around the world. All 10 million users of Airbnb, all 10 million users of Expedia, all 10 million users of Travelocity are all effectively competing in bids, or they're all potential customers for a given sale of a hotel room. But once that gets sold to some small guy who just is running his own website that maybe gets a couple hundred viewers, his ability to resell that room is lowered because he doesn't have as large of a potential customer base. So if you just have a system where once that secondary sale is happening, it can only happen on one platform, you have an inherent disadvantage for everybody who is doing a secondary sale. Making the lease interoperable between all of the different platforms is what makes it possible to continue to advertise the secondary sales to the entire pool of customers and not just artificially silo it onto a single platform.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. There's really four innovations here, it seems like. The first is, besides Airbnb, just creating a culture where we're willing to rent rooms from people we don't know. So the first is the digital representation, the smart contract created through the non-fungible token of the lease, right? The second is something that I think you didn't mention, is that you actually block off via iCal, which is the system for booking on a lot of these platforms, the availability on those platforms, right? So you essentially use these APIs to ensure that you don't have a failure to deliver. Maybe we could talk a little bit more about that. The third kind of challenge is that even though we've moved to this world where there is a kind of a norm around renting from people we don't know, you still need to do a bunch of supplier vetting. And so you're not creating kind of an opaque marketplace where these smart contracts can be traded. You're combining it with a public marketplace, and you're doing a lot of work around building reputation and information in this modern marketplace experience so that the suppliers are properly vetted, right? And then the fourth thing that you've mentioned is that you're then driving demand to that marketplace such that you can create this secondary market over time, and you don't have this silo effect that would happen if you were only working within one of these particular booking platforms. Did I get that right?
Yeah, most of that. We don't have the supplier vetting system. We take more of an incentives-based approach to that, which kind of goes into the escrow system. But, to go into the kind of failure to deliver thing that you were talking about a little bit, and this also links into the escrow system, which also links into the incentives, right? The way that our escrow system works kind of protects people against the failure to deliver problem is by I think actually I saw in the notes that you gave me kind of the diagrams that we had put together for how various transactions here work, right? When a renter pays into our contract, they get to mint the NFT that entitles them to their booking right away, but the funds don't clear to the property owner. They go into an escrow smart contract that designates one, the holder of the NFT, and then two, the property owner as potential parties who can receive a distribution of funds in the event of a dispute, right? And then the third thing that the smart contract does is it sets a kind of time that opens up a dispute period from the check-in date to 24 hours after that check-in date. So if someone was to come along and fake being a supplier or anything like that, they could do that and they could theoretically waste somebody's time. But at the end of the day, they're not going to actually make any money because someone is going to show up and want to rent a room and not be able to, and they're going to immediately dispute it on our site. And then it gets kicked up to arbitration and 100% of the funds will go back to the holder of the NFT, the booking at that time. So by doing this, by having this escrow system and by pinning it so that the recipient of the funds in the event of a dispute that decides in favor of the renter is the holder of the NFT, we effectively make it completely impossible to profit via fraud off of TripsTrade. So that is one of the kind of innovations, and we're doing all of this without TripsTrade ever actually taking ownership of your funds or of your money. We're not like FTX or anything like that, where you're putting your money onto our platform and we're taking custody of it. Up until the very moment that one of these parties claims their money, it just sits in a smart contract. We as arbitrators can decide which of those two parties get the funds in what amounts, but we can't do anything other than sending it to those two parties. So we're enabling this whole market to not only be liquid and go from OTC to transferable instruments, but we're doing so in a way that doesn't require any sort of like trusted custodians or anything like that. So it really is a new liquid, non-fungible market that is decentralized and custody risk-free.
Cool. And who can become an arbitrator?
Yeah, right now that is purely just done by TripsTrade and third parties that we hire for that. Certainly, I do think that there's a possibility to, if we really want to go gung-ho on the decentralization in the future, there might be parties like Claros who could be a good fit for that, or there might be some sort of system where we would enable DAO contributors to do that. I think that I know that there's a lot of good reason to be skeptical of the idea of gradual decentralization. But I do think when we're doing something as big as trying to bring liquidity to a $2.3 trillion market, we can't really go fully decentralized from day one. So there is some level of trust. You have to trust us that we will not make ridiculous decisions as arbitrators. But again, there is no way for us to profit off of our decisions as arbitrators. The only thing that we can do to benefit ourselves is to make the best, fairest, and most transparent decisions in arbitrating any dispute. So we can only benefit by increasing our reputation. There's no way for us to get funds through being the arbitrators of the process.
Okay, makes a lot of sense. And there's a couple of other things that are coming up on the roadmap that are mentioned in the white paper around splitting leases and account abstraction. Can you talk a little bit about those two?
Yeah, so right now in our system, one issue is you book for a week at a property, right? And then you open that up for resale. Maybe you just don't want to go. Maybe you are a speculator who just thinks you have some sort of edge on the market. Someone wants to come along and rent 3 to 4 days, not a whole week. There doesn't exist right now a way on our system for you to split that lease up. So you've got to either cut them a deal or not sell to them, which is obviously not ideal. And it's actually a little bit of a deal breaker when it comes to the long-term lease market. So it's a big part of why our current system is very short-term rental here, right? What we're building is a system where when that happens and someone does that bid for 4 days out of your week, you'll be able to approve it, burn the original NFT, and mint 2 new NFTs, one for the 4 days that guy wanted to buy, which goes, and the second for the 3 days that it remain, which stays with you. And that will enable us to not only make the market more efficient, but also to start servicing long-term rentals, which is a much larger market and is really the long-term goal of this anyways, right? On the account abstraction or externally owned account side, we already have some pretty cool systems for this built. So right now, if you go to TripsTrade and you try to sign in, you'll see that one of the options is a Google sign-in or email password sign-in. You can connect to our site as a property owner right now, onboard your property, sign it up and everything. And when you sign in through that Google or email, what it's going to do is it's going to spin you up an entirely new wallet that is managed by a smart contract, load just a little bit of Matic into that for gas. And then you're going to be able to, as a user, create NFT collections around your property, allow the minting of your property, collect payment in stable coins through that property, and then cash those out to fiat. And you can do all of that without ever interacting with a wallet, without ever having MetaMask or Trust Wallet or anything like that on your computer. It really is an example of being able to using blockchain without knowing it. You know, the test that we put this through, I work a lot on the UX side myself. And the test that I always had was, I live in Thailand. Can I give this to an elderly Thai person who's familiar with Airbnb, and they can use the system to add their property and accept a rental with no instruction? And we have passed that test now. People who have certainly no idea what blockchain is or wallets are or anything like that can come to TripsTrade and act fully as property owners. And we're working right now on a system to allow renters to do that as well. We've got in a test environment right now, our Google sign-in and wallet system working entirely in conjunction with renters paying into our escrow contract as well. We're just waiting for some compliance stuff on the credit card side of things. But once that's complete, you'll be able to, as a renter, come to TripsTrade, find a property that you want to rent, use your credit card to pay down that property. It'll take your credit card, purchase stable coins, and use that wallet that was spun up for you to pay into the escrow smart contract. And then you'll be able to either resell it and take in stable coins and cash those out to the bank account or the credit card that you used, or you'll be able to use your rental, and the property owner will be able to cash out their stable coins directly into fiat to their bank account or their credit card. All of that will be totally possible for every single party involved using custody-free escrow smart contracts that are in-house developed and that really don't require that you trust TripsTrade at all with holding on to your money. And you'll be able to do that without ever touching MetaMask or having to learn what a seed phrase is or.
I want to stop you before you go too much further into this wallet thing. I really want to back up and explain, our audience is definitely probably like 50-60% crypto savvy, but can you start by explaining the types of wallets that are out there? And then I would love to hear you tell us a little bit about smart contract wallets, and if it makes sense for your infrastructure, MPC wallets, because it sounds like they're all even MPC use cases for what you're doing, depending on what kind of arbitration or whatever actually comes up in the social world that reflects the business and economic relationships. So basically, can you tell us first? You mentioned this use case around, can a Thai grandma use my wallet? What are the wallets that are out there today, and what sucks about them?
Yeah, so I mean, if you have what I would refer to as like a self-custodied wallet, right, or like a cell phone wallet, this is like MetaMask or a Trust wallet or something like that. You are responsible for, keeping track of your own seed phrase, setting the RPCs and like the inputs so that you have like this direct network added. You've got to add in, import each new contract address for each new token, and you got to learn what all these things are. Right. And that is, for those of us who just do this, it's stuff that we all went through and stuff that to us now it all seems very simple now. But for a lot of people, like just the stumbling step of, okay, I'm going to go download MetaMask. Well, now I don't have any gas. How do I get gas? Wait, I have to use a credit card. Like,
should I write these words on paper, or should I, emblazon them onto a piece of metal or something? Because this is important shit. If you put $1 million in a smart contract wallet, you want to make sure if it lasts through a fire or a flood or anything, right? So yeah.
You take all of your proper OPSEC steps, right? And then, one day you log onto your computer and it turns out you didn't update your Messenger app and $400,000 got drained from a browser extension on your computer, right?
Yep.
Like, it's not feasible for most people, right? But their other option, if they don't want to do something like a MetaMask or a Trust wallet, is they can go to an exchange, right? They could go to a Binance or an FTX or a Coinbase or something like that. And they can say, I don't want to deal with any of that. I just want to have fun, playing around with shit coins and stuff like that. I'm just going to trust Coinbase and Binance to manage my affairs. And they're effectively giving me a UX through which I can manage this wallet. But I am having to give them my money. And I am having to trust that they're properly managing my seed phrase. And I am having to, and we all know, anybody who's lived through the last 6 months knows that sometimes, you put your trust in people who have been signed off on by some very powerful people. And then it turns out that maybe weren't doing everything they should have been doing.
Exactly.
Right?
And this is basically for the listeners, this is basically what your bank does. Your bank is custodying your assets. It can lend them out to people, but you have at any time, you have a right to go in and say, give me my money, of course. And it's backed by, deposit insurance, what have you. In the crypto economy, that concept does not exist. So just so you're following along, right? And so I'd love to hear, that's a great background. Thank you for that. And then I'd love to hear more, as we transition now to smart contract wallets. I don't think everyone knows what that is, right? So some of the popular ones, there's Gnosis Safe, which is like what everyone uses. There's Linen, there's a bunch of others. So I'd love to hear more. Like, did you guys develop your own smart contract wallet? And then maybe you can tell us a bit about what exactly it is. I mean, you can intuit it so far getting to this point of the pod, but just to make it clear.
Sure. So we did, all of our stuff is completely in-house developed. Our smart contract wallet is not necessarily the same as something like a Gnosis or something like that. I can get into like multi-sigs and stuff if you want after. Our system effectively is a little bit of like a middle ground between the I completely own and run everything myself side of things and the I own nothing, I'm trusting a third party with holding all my stuff side of things. The middle ground, which is where we are, you come to our site, you sign up with your email, you sign up with your Google sign-in or something like that. You don't have to worry about managing a seed phrase or setting the right RPC endpoints or anything like that. You don't have to import the contract addresses for tokens into your wallet. You don't have to learn how to do any of that stuff or even worry about getting your first little bit of gas, right? All of these are very typical onboarding problems for crypto. But at the same time, TripsTrade itself does not control the seed phrases to your wallet or the private keys or anything like that. We built a system, it lives on the blockchain. It is just an automated system that when you are signing up, is going to spin you up a new wallet for you. And all of the actions that your wallet takes are going to be managed through that smart contract, which is completely transparent. It's just out there. You can go vet the code for it yourself. You can check what it's doing yourself. There is no possible scenario where we could, go in and sneak in and take your money and lever it up and give it to Alameda or anything like that, right?
Or build a bucket of vacation property backed securities or something.
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to worry about the risk that the guy who is holding on to your crypto or your cash is going to just take it and, go hang out in the Maldives or whatever, or do something irresponsible with it. Every single step that your money takes is completely automated and completely transparent. Now, the one thing is, you still, in this case, you don't have a direct seed phrase or private key yourself. So the one thing that you wouldn't be able to do, and this is why it's kind of a middle ground, is you wouldn't be able to take that wallet and then say, you know what, I just want to control this. I'm going to go import this to MetaMask. You would not be able to do that, but you can still use it in all of the ways that you would like to using our interface and withdraw that crypto to your own privately held wallet or to your own exchange wallet, or you can just cash out directly through our site. But it's kind of like a healthy middle ground that exists that enables people who don't want to spend the 20 hours getting up to date on the learning curve with how to do all this stuff. They just want to rent out their home or they just want to rent the property while also not having to trust some, random guy they never met before. And frankly, as a company, it puts us in a position where we don't have to take on the custodian risk. Your cash, which, believe it or not, we really don't want to do that.
I believe it for sure. Yeah, I think, one thing I do want to ask you, to getting super granular and maybe a stupid question, but if you can talk to us a bit then about, if I'm a property owner on your platform, and how do I, when I forget my Airbnb password, right? I'm like, oh shit, I forgot my password. Let me request one. How does that work for you folks now, if you don't have a seed phrase and with the architecture you have? Just talking us through the UX on the property owner side for a super simple use case like that.
Sure. So do you just mean like the case where somebody signs in and has that externally or abstracted wallet and they've lost their email password or something?
Yeah, basically. Yeah. Like because if we go, I'm not going to get into this too much because I don't think it applies, but Vitalik, a bunch of other people over the years have written extensively about like social recovery of seed phrases, community recovery of seed phrases, right? Stuff like that, where that would require multi-party computation. So I'm curious to know, like, how would recovery work here? Because you're building something that's super necessary for this, in exactly the way that it sounds like. I love it, but I also want the audience to be like, what does this new paradigm look like? What happens when I lose my my password or what have you, right? How do I get my account access back?
You would be in a situation where if you signed in with a Gmail, right, and you lost your password to your Gmail and you wanted to sign in on our site again, you do need to go get the password to your email, right? So hopefully you have a backup email or something set up for that. But there is some good news, right? Let's say that you were a property owner and you used our system and you had made 100 bookings, right?
Yeah.
And then you lost your email password and there was no way for you to get it back, right? Because of that iCal system that got mentioned earlier, all of your bookings are going to be on your calendar. And if you go into your calendar, you will get the confirmation code for those bookings, which is how you identify the renter is the actual guy who owns the booking on each of those calendar invites. And another cool thing about that, by the way, every time the booking changes hands, that confirmation code changes. You can see it the whole time. The renter can't see it until they check it. So there's no way to defraud or double spend a rent, right? But so you would be in a situation where if you couldn't recover your password to your email, there wouldn't really be a way for you to access it other than through calling us and maybe just saying, hey, I can prove that this account is connected to this Airbnb profile. I will message you on this Airbnb profile. We could potentially do something like that with you. But the reality is, if you lost your email and password, you wouldn't be able to use our email password.
I'm thinking about generating NFTs that represent your bookings that you could just send to any wallet, right? And be like, hey, actually, I have this wallet that's collected all of them that's linked to this one and has a trail and has provenance, like or something like that. Could be an interesting use case for you guys as another way of recovery. But that's like pie in the sky stuff.
Well, we do also have systems where when you sign in with your email, right, you can link your phone and you can link other social media profiles to your account. So now that I'm thinking about it, if you had already lost your email and you hadn't linked anything else, there would really be nothing that we could do. But, the sensible step for anybody to take is just when you sign in with your email, link it to your Twitter, link it to your phone. And that way we can just send you a simple text. This is how our system works right now is if you forget your password, we can send you a simple text to reset it. But yeah, if you haven't taken the step to do that, there's not really much we can do.
Yeah, and that infra exists a bit to some extent. I mean, I assumed you're building on Polygon because you mentioned Matic, but maybe you're not. But you can import a lens profile the same to an adjacent wallet or something and connect that in. Yeah, there's a lot of options. So it's cool, at least so that people can understand there's a universe of options that's being built out with Web3 infra as well, that then at least gives you some security and some backup in these instances.
Well, it's all about which risks you want to tolerate, right? There's like this spectrum of control where if you control everything yourself, you don't ever have to worry about somebody messing with your money, but you do have to worry that if you slip up once, there's no one to back you out. There's no FDIC for you to give you your money back if some guy, managed to steal your seed phrase or you approve the wrong contract and your wallet gets drained, right? And then, like we were talking about earlier, there's also the totally opposite end of that, which is you just trust all your money to some exchange and you just say, well, CZ would never rug me. He's been doing it for years. It's going to be totally fine, right? And that's maybe true, but you're no longer in control. And you may have to go through things like KYC or AML or something like that. This space in the middle of those options, which is all of the systems that will remove a little bit of custodial risk or all of the custodial risk, but maybe put a little bit more risk in, is the smart contract written correctly? Or, am I going to forget my email password or something like that? That is a very unexplored middle ground, but that is probably the sweet spot for the proper balance between decentralization and easy UX, right? And that's, I think, where we've done some of our best work is building what I think is one of the best in market examples of someone who completely has no idea how all of this works, but wants access to this market, having a way to do so without having to trust some third party custodian. And I think you're going to see, as crypto B2C really, starts to blow up more, I think you are going to see more innovation in that space. And that's probably what most of the mass adoption looks like in the future.
Just for my own knowledge, just from this conversation, what KYC do you have to, let's imagine that I now have a bunch of securities in this wallet that are worth quite a bit of money, and just in terms of future value. What sort of KYC do I have to go through in this process? Or what do you imagine I'll have to go through as the system scales?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by securities. Are you referring to that in like the Howey sense or the Howey test sense?
I'm referring to the digital representation of the future value of lease. Let's imagine that I've got, 10,000 NFTs at this point, and they're worth cumulatively, just a ton of money at this point, right? $1 million plus. Can I hold those without going through any sort of compliance?
Yeah, so I don't think that the SEC or anyone is going to take a stance that sublettable leases are securities. I can see how you can get there from the Howey test, but effectively what our system is doing is taking an already existing system, which is like if you've ever rented an apartment and part of that contract was you can rent this out to other people if you want, right? Like a sublettable lease. We are making that into not something that you need to go to them and have them physically sign it, but something that you can transfer to them with the click of a button, right? The SEC, to my knowledge, has never argued that the existence of those contracts, like you're renting this apartment, but you can rent it out to someone else, is a security. And accordingly, there's no precedent that we're aware of, and we have looked into this, that says you need to do KYC or AML or anything like that in order to buy a hotel room just so that you can resell it to somebody else.
Okay. But in this, I would imagine you're going to create derivative markets and secondary markets. And over time, the bundling of the leases will require that at some point.
Yeah, so if you go to that point, which is like very, very far down the line for us, this is a theoretical system that we call lease slabs. And this is what we would really like to build next if all the stars align. But that point, there may certainly be some securities. And for those particular markets and those particular assets, yeah, there's probably going to be increased KYC burden. And also, just frankly, this isn't necessarily a compliance thing, but just in that market where people are issuing properties that are going to be turned into derivatives and indexes and things like that, there probably is also a lot more supplier verification that goes into the process than what we currently have just for the short-term rentals market, which is very minimal. But for those kind of things, that's not really like a smart contract build. That's more of a kind of off-chain UX build where just you're not going to be able to access those features through our UX without going through a compliance system. You could imagine something though in the future, kind of like a Uniswap, where there might exist the bare bones smart contracts that are needed to do things like that anyone can use without going through compliance. But if you want to go through the centralized UX, you will have to KYC, or there will be some geo blocking or things like that, right? Like Uniswap right now, if you try to go trade on their UI, right? Like actual app.uniswap.org, and you're in North Korea or some geo-block location, you're not going to be able to do it. But at the same time, if you go to their smart contracts, you could be anywhere in the world, and the Ethereum network is not going to censor your transactions because that's just open source code that just lives out there. That's probably what a kind of long-term vision for that looks like, where there is a system that you will be able to use without KYC if you are savvy enough to go into Etherscan or go into the actual smart contract and execute it yourself. But if you want access to the fancy UX and all the cool charts and all of the easy to use systems, you will have to go through a compliance process because that does have to be hosted by a centralized third party.
Makes sense. Cool. So where is the system at today, and have you guys begun to monetize it?
Yeah, so TripsTrade is totally live today. All of the features I talked about, except the ones in the last like 1.5 minutes, are completely live, up and running with real properties. We're doing business, we're doing increasing amounts of business. Almost all of our properties right now are in Phuket, Thailand, which is where I live, but we do also have properties in Bermuda, Greece, Lisbon, the US, and I think Costa Rica as well. But we have already opened it. You can go up, anybody can sign their property up, anybody can rent. And what we've seen so far in terms of activity is approximately 2/3 of activity is people buying their initial rental, and 1/3 of activity is people reselling that rental, and that's in aggregated dollar amount. So I do think we've seen, to at least some extent, a proof of concept of the idea that if you put this tech out there, there are interested parties who are buying and reselling these rental speculative purposes. And I also think it shows that there are people who are in a situation where they maybe buy because they wanted to travel, but they have to cancel last minute. And so they end up reselling it, right? And that creates a lot of new, interesting price dynamics that I think is going to make for some really cool data in the future too.
Awesome. And so in terms of the organizational structure, it's essentially a company. You've got your co-founder and a small team. Are there interesting elements of the marketplace that have shared ownership or governance rights? You mentioned a DAO or the potential for a DAO earlier. Is that stuff you're thinking about, or you just see that as down the line at this point?
Yeah, so we have thought a lot about having the fee structure set up to DAO governance. One of the things that people complain a lot about Airbnb, they take a pretty fat cut, and it's very unevenly split between the renter and the property owner. So if you rent on Airbnb, on average, the property owner is going to get charged about 3%, and the renter is going to get charged about 14%, right? We have a little bit of an option to go a lot lower than that. We currently charge 1% plus a certain fee if you want to cash out, right? But we can charge a lot lower than that because of those initial transactions on rental, which don't cost us anything to host, and because we don't take custodian risks, so we have a much lower compliance burden. But we think that there are some interesting potentials to having the DAO or having a DAO control fee structures on our system. And I do think long-term, there's a lot of potential for the idea of maybe a community-owned investment fund that looks at all this data that we've gotten. And, I mentioned earlier that the way that Expedia and Travelocity and those guys make money is they are going into places where they have data on hotel mispricings, essentially, and then reselling those after buying at the rack rate. I think there's a lot of potential for us to do that, and we will have data on secondary sales market that nobody else in the world has, because nobody else has the technological capabilities to make that market exist. So I think there's a possibility for a community-owned fund of that has a kind of unfair advantage of having best access to all of that data, but that's kind of long-term down the road for us.
Okay, cool. So I see how this creates significant value to the supply side over time, right? And to the speculators. I rent out property. This would be really valuable for me. If you figure out the long-term lease, kind of breaking up the long-term leases, that would also be valuable in some regards. But I also live in a building in Barcelona with a ton of Airbnbs and see kind of the negative ramifications of Airbnb in terms of pricing. What are the benefits to the consumer here, and how do you see those benefits segmented between the short-term market that you're focused on now and the innovations that you plan to create in the long-term market?
So the one that immediately comes to mind for the renters, right? All of the stuff that I talked about with kind of the last minute cancellation problem. I go buy a rental at one of the places in Barcelona, right? I'm planning on traveling to Barcelona, let's say for a month, right? Last minute, I decide that I can't make it. And they have a cancellation policy that says if I cancel with 30 or 60 days or less on my booking, I don't get any of my money back. There's no incentive for me as the renter at that point to clear up that schedule or enable someone else to rent it. I literally cannot sell that to a third party, even if I'm willing to do so at a 75% discount, right? And what do I get if I cancel my booking so that the host can resell it? I get nothing. I'm not going to get any of my money back. Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, I lost my money. That sucks. I'm just not going to touch my phone or look at it. And then no one's going to stay in that place. It's going to be a home that someone could have used to, keep the rain off their heads, that instead is just going in. Under the TripsTrade system or the Lease Lab system, that exact same scenario happens. I know I'm not going to be able to make the trip. I, as a traveler, have a chance to recoup some of my money. But I know that because I'm selling this at the last minute, I have to offer that at a big discount because it's going to be people who are looking at it. I want to clear it. I'm probably not going to get all of my money back, but I'm willing to sell it for 25% of what I bought it for because I just want to get what I can back. I now get a little bit of my money back, so I've benefited that way. And there's some renter out there who previously would not have been able to stay in this home who now has a chance to buy it at a 75% discount. So yes, there will be speculative bubbles, just like anything, but there will also be cases where someone goes out there, they speculate, or they cancel their trip, and normally you wouldn't have had access to that. But now, because of our system existing, the people who need a home, who need shelter, have a chance to buy it at effectively like flash sale prices.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I think what'll be interesting is in these markets that are hot, so Barcelona, Amsterdam, tier one markets, right? When your system scales, the flexibility that you offer to consumers around cancellation in the secondary market and the selling pressure that creates from the increased consumer choice versus the innovations that you create in the long-term rental space that will probably, honestly, and the securitization that you create around lease labs, what is the trade-off going to be? I think the question that'll become interesting is what's the trade-off going to be between the selling pressure from the increased consumer choice against the securitization that essentially allows a bunch of people that already own a bunch of assets to more effectively own more assets, right? Probably pushing up pricing. And so whether or not the end consumer actually benefits from this will be kind of interesting to see. Like I'm generally in favor of liquid markets over OT versus OTC markets, right? And so theoretically, this should be net positive, but I can also see in certain localities how this could have a negative impact as well, even though it's a great innovation.
Certainly, I do agree it's something to keep a watch on. But one thing I would say in terms of the idea of, what we've already seen, which is like an increased stratification between people who have assets being able to leverage them up and buy more. versus people who don't, not being able to get mobility or get wealth or anything like that. You know, when you're thinking of these contracts, right, rental contracts, they're not like home ownership. Home ownership is so long as you continue to pay to maintain the home, you pay your taxes, it's indefinite. Every rental contract comes with a check-in date. And if you don't sell this contract by that check-in date, or if it's a long-term contract, you can maybe sell it halfway through. But for the short-term side, if you don't sell this contract by that check-in date, you're just going to lose all your money. I mean, that's just, it is what it is, right? So if you're some asset speculator and you go out there and you buy up a bunch of tier one rentals, right? And you're trying to get like a 10x profit or something like that, and it turns out that there just isn't the demand for that, you are going to have to sell it at lower and lower price points until you meet that price point where someone is willing to pay for it. And I think that allowing for that kind of increased price discovery is something that will actually benefit consumers who are able to kind of be savvy and go out there and monitor markets and find a good deal. I do think, though, that there certainly will be cases where there's markets that, you know, maybe would not have seen this kind of influx of capital, but someone decides that they're going to go out and pre-purchase things, and you might see areas that have prices get higher. But I believe that on net, what you're going to see is the same as any other market with time-based assets, like options where there's decay and things like that. There's going to be a stratification where most contracts are going to get increasingly cheap as that date of, you know, in options land expiry, but in rental land like check-in approaches. And I think what you could see is a pretty significant increase in people who are looking for places to rent and who are looking at places where there is that date coming up soon, getting flash deals, which is something that doesn't really exist in the current market because there are no digital representations. Those dates don't really exist, right? You can get like great deals on hotel rooms, but it's not something where there exists like a flash market for that. We have the possibility to provide that, and I think that could be of a lot of benefit to the consumer.
Yeah, I think in kind of the hotel booking or the Airbnb market, the short-term market, the consumer surplus, the benefits to consumers is really clear. I think where it becomes less clear, or not less clear, but where it'll be interesting to see where this plays out is in kind of if you actually bring longer term leases into this marketplace and start bundling those and then create, you know, liquidity around those, and how major players in the market come into the market and start buying those up. And I could see, you know, this fundamentally shifting, you know, in very specific geographies, and home ownership versus rental rates kind of evolve over time. But that's, you know, years from now. So I guess to close up, you guys are raising a round right now. Do you want to talk at all about that on the pod?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to keep it a little bit vague, but we are raising, like, just because I know that there's like disclosure rules about like going out and saying, you know, what exact terms are.
Exactly.
This is for accredited investors only and is not a pitch.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's not financial advice. I hold no license. It's all that. But we are raising an equity round for accredited investors. I guess I could say like it's low single digit millions. So it's probably not like Tiger Capital status, but I think we've built a lot of really cool stuff. I think we're innovating in areas in the space that are in high demand and that no one else is innovating in. And certainly if you're hearing this and anything about the idea of using NFTs to bring liquidity to non-fungible asset classes appeals to you, you should certainly hit me up. I'm always in the TripsTrade Discord, and at proof_Steve on Twitter. Proof of Steve, so pretty easy to find.
That's funny. I have one more question before we finish up here. The experience of onboarding, right, where you're essentially creating this really easy sign up process. Have you thought about abstracting that out into an app itself that other ventures could use?
So it's funny, like when we build a lot of things, you know, I don't know if you remember when I can't remember who was the first to do it or the second to do it after us, but somebody a while ago launched a wallet-to-wallet gas-free chat, right? And this was before the Etherscan chat even. And they were kind of doing this as like that big announcement. We had actually launched that a few months earlier ourselves. And I guess this is something I didn't talk about, but on our system, there is a wallet-to-wallet free, no gas chat that anybody can use. But that, our escrow and the account abstraction are all things that we have talked to people about. And when we show them that, it's their initial response is always like, oh, you guys should build another company around this. And at some point, when we keep getting people to say that to us, I'm like, man, I think if I did that every time someone told me that, I'd be running like 20 companies by now. If you guys are interested in that, if anybody out there is wanting to pay to white label those things, certainly nicer for me than selling off equity. So maybe hit me up on Twitter.
Cool. Thanks so much for your time here. Where can people follow you online?
Like I said, best place is Twitter. I'm pretty active there. So @proof_Steve. I'm the WASI on the big red TripsTrade background.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steve.